They say a mother's instinct is nature's most powerful force. That a mother knows her child's cry in a crowd of thousands, feels their pain before the first tear falls, senses danger before it strikes. For generations, they called it superstition, dismissed it as hormone-driven anxiety, used it to label women as hysterical. But Naomi Carter knew different. She knew when that platinum-haired nurse's smile never reached her eyes, knew when they pushed that extra dose of anesthesia into her IV, knew, even as consciousness slipped away, that something was terribly wrong at St. Augustine's Medical Center. They told her the baby was stillborn, showed her a too small bundle and called it grief when she said it wasn't her son, pushed papers for immediate cremation, and blamed her questions on trauma. But a mother knows. And as Naomi traced the stars on the yellow blanket she'd bought for her nursery, the same blanket now hanging in a wealthy family's window across town, she understood why they'd tried so hard to silence her. Because sometimes the truth doesn't stay buried. Sometimes it grows, like a seed in darkness, until it breaks through concrete and steel, through decades of secrets, through walls built by money and power. They thought they could steal her baby, erase his existence, and send her home to grieve, a death that never happened. They were about to learn that they'd made a fatal mistake. Never underestimate a mother's love. This isn't just a story about stolen babies and corrupt hospitals. This is a story about justice wearing a mother's face, about the power that rises when women refuse to be silenced, about the reckoning that comes when the wrong child is taken from the wrong mother. And at St. Augustine's Medical Center, that reckoning has just begun. Just before we get back to it, I'd love to know where you're watching from today, and if you're enjoying these stories, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow's special episode is one you definitely don't want to miss. Naomi Carter stood before her bedroom mirror, smoothing her maternity dress over her 9-month belly. Her dark hands trembled slightly as she adjusted the fabric, trying to look presentable for her final prenatal checkup. After 3 years of trying, countless prayers, and one devastating miscarriage, she and Jordan were finally about to meet. Their miracle. "You look beautiful, baby," Jordan's deep voice came from the doorway. He walked over, wrapping his strong arms around her from behind, his chocolate skin contrasting with the soft lavender of her dress. "Everything's going to be perfect." Naomi wanted to believe him, but the nightmares had been getting worse. Every night for the past week she'd wake up in a cold sweat, the hospital corridors in her dreams growing longer and darker, filled with shadows that whispered things she couldn't quite hear. Sometimes she'd find herself running through those endless hallways, searching for something precious she couldn't name, while faceless figures in white coats watched her struggle. "I just can't shake this feeling," she admitted, leaning back against his chest. "Remember how Nurse Rourke acted last time? She wouldn't even look at me when she took my blood pressure." Jordan kissed the top of her head. "Sarah Rourke? That older nurse with the platinum blonde hair? Baby, she probably just had a bad day. You know how overworked hospital staff are." "It's not just that." Naomi turned to face him, her brown eyes serious. "She's been different ever since we switched to St. Augustine's. The way she whispers with Dr. Miller when they think I'm not looking. Something feels off." "You're just nervous." "About the delivery," Jordan assured her, but Naomi could see the slight furrow in his brow. He'd noticed it too, even if he wouldn't admit it. "Come on, we don't want to be late." Naomi gathered her things, pausing to run her fingers over the soft yellow blanket she'd bought for the nursery. They decorated it in gentle earth tones, with hand-painted clouds drifting across the walls and a mobile of silver stars hanging above the crib. Everything was ready. Everything was perfect. So why couldn't she silence the voice of doubt in her mind? The drive to Patterson's pharmacy was quiet. Naomi lost in thought as Jordan navigated the morning traffic. They needed to pick up a few last-minute items before the appointment, and Naomi had insisted on getting extra supplies for their hospital bag. Better to be over-prepared, she'd told Jordan, though she couldn't explain the urgency she felt. As they pulled into the parking lot, Naomi's mind wandered to the ultrasound photos tucked safely in her purse. Their baby boy was healthy, strong, active. Dr. Miller had said so himself. So why had he suddenly started talking about potential complications at their last visit? The words felt wrong, like a false note in an otherwise perfect symphony. DC. Automatic doors of Patterson's pharmacy whooshed open, cool air conditioning a welcome relief from the August heat. While Jordan went to grab her prenatal vitamins, Naomi wandered down the baby aisle, running her fingers over tiny socks and onesies. Each item she touched sparked a vision of their future. First steps, first words, first everything. First time mama? Naomi turned to find an elderly black woman watching her, leaning heavily on a wooden cane. There was something knowing in her eyes that made Naomi's skin prickle, something that spoke of old pain and hidden truths. Yes, Naomi smiled, resting a hand on her belly. Just a few more days now. The woman's expression darkened. St. Augustine's? Naomi's smile faltered. How did you know? I see their paperwork in your bag. The woman stepped closer, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Listen to me carefully, child. Not all babies leave that hospital alive. A chill ran down Naomi's spine. What do you mean? The woman glanced around as if checking for eavesdroppers. They've been there a long time, those white walls. Seen a lot of things, hidden a lot of things. She gripped Naomi's arm with surprising strength. Keep your eyes open, child. Trust your instincts. But before Naomi could press for more details, the woman was shuffling away, leaving nothing but questions and a lingering sense of dread. When Jordan returned, Naomi told him about the strange encounter, trying to keep her voice steady despite the fear churning in her stomach. That's crazy talk, he said, but she could hear the uncertainty in his voice. Come on, we need to get to your appointment. Later that afternoon, while Jordan was at work, Naomi called her best friend Lisa. They'd known each other since college, and Lisa had always been the voice of reason in their friendship. But as Naomi recounted everything, the nurse's behavior, the doctor's sudden concern, the old woman's warning, she could hear the skepticism in Lisa's responses. Girl, you need to stop overthinking this, Lisa sighed. St. Augustine's is one of the best hospitals in the state. My cousin had both her kids there, no problems at all. Your cousin is white, Naomi pointed out, her free hand absently rubbing her belly as the baby kicked. Don't start with that, Lisa cut her off. You're going to stress yourself out for nothing. Just focus on having a healthy baby. Besides, Jordan's right. Old people say crazy things all the time. She probably wasn't all there. Naomi wanted to argue, to make Lisa understand that this wasn't just pregnancy anxiety or hormones. But how could she explain the wrongness she felt? The way Nurse Rourke's smile never reached her eyes. The whispered conversations that stopped whenever she entered a room. That evening, everything changed. Naomi was in the kitchen, preparing the chicken soup Jordan loved, when Dr. Miller's office called. The calm voice of the receptionist informed her that they needed to move up her delivery date. Doctor's orders, she said, her tone professionally distant. We've noticed some concerning patterns in your latest tests. What patterns? Naomi demanded, her hand tightening on the phone. Everything was fine at my last checkup. The baby was healthy. Dr. Miller said so himself. Dr. Miller will explain everything tomorrow. Please arrive at the hospital by 8 a.m. for your scheduled C-section. C-section? Naomi's voice rose. Nobody said anything about a C-section. I want to speak to Dr. Miller now. But the line had already gone dead, leaving Naomi standing in her kitchen with the smell of soup beginning to burn. She turned off the stove with shaking hands, then sank into a chair, her mind racing. Why would they suddenly change everything? Why wouldn't they explain? She was still sitting there when Jordan came home, the soup long cold on the stove. But before she could tell him about the call, the first contraction hit. The pain was sharp, unexpected, stealing her breath and her words. Baby? Jordan was at her side instantly, his face etched with concern. What's wrong? The baby. She gasped. He's coming, but it's too early. Something's wrong, Jordan. Something's wrong. The drive to St. Augustine's passed in a blur of pain and fear. The hospital's gleaming white exterior looked more imposing than ever in the darkness, its windows like watching eyes. As Jordan helped her through the entrance, Naomi caught sight of Nurse Rourke at the reception desk, whispering urgently to a tall doctor she didn't recognize. The doctor glanced her way, his expression grave. "Mrs. Carter," Nurse Rourke's voice was honeyed sweet as she approached, but her eyes were cold. "Let's get you settled in." Everything happened too quickly after that. The hospital staff moved with an efficiency that felt rehearsed, mechanical. Nurses appeared and disappeared, checking monitors, adjusting equipment. When Naomi protested the extra dose of anesthesia they insisted on administering, her concerns were dismissed with practiced ease. "It's for your own good," Nurse Rourke said, adjusting the IV drip. "We want to make sure you're comfortable." "Jordan," Naomi reached for her husband's hand, her vision already starting to blur. "Something's wrong. This isn't right. They're giving me too much." "Shh, baby, everything's fine." Jordan's voice seemed to come from far away. "The doctors know what they're doing." Naomi tried to focus on his face, but the world was growing dim around the edges. She could hear voices talking over her head, their words becoming increasingly difficult to understand, but one phrase cut through the fog with crystal clarity. "She won't remember a thing." The words followed her down into darkness, along with the echo of the old woman's warning. Not all babies leave that hospital alive. The last thing she saw before consciousness slipped away completely was Nurse Rourke's satisfied smile, and in that moment, Naomi knew with terrifying certainty that she'd been right all along. Something was very, very wrong at St. Augustine's Medical Center. But by then, it was too late. The harsh fluorescent lights pierced through Naomi's consciousness like needles. Her eyelids felt heavy, weighted down by the lingering effects of whatever they'd given her. The room slowly came into focus, sterile white walls, beeping monitors, and the antiseptic smell that seemed embedded in every hospital surface. But something was wrong. The air felt too thick, too quiet, lacking the chaos and joy that should accompany a new birth. Dr. Miller stood at the foot of her bed, his face a mask of professional sympathy. Behind him, a group of doctors and nurses hovered like pale ghosts, their expressions carefully neutral. Naomi tried to sit up, but her limbs wouldn't cooperate. Her throat felt raw as if she'd been screaming. "Mrs. Carter," Dr. Miller's voice was soft, practiced. "I'm very sorry, but there were complications during the delivery." Naomi's heart stopped. "My baby?" The words came out as a whisper. A nurse stepped forward, not Rourke, but another one with kind eyes and graying hair. In her arms she carried a small bundle wrapped in a hospital blanket. Too small. Much too small. "I'm so sorry," the nurse said, gently placing the bundle in Naomi's trembling arms. He was stillborn. The world seemed to tilt on its axis as Naomi looked down at the tiny face. Something was wrong. This wasn't right. This couldn't be right. She'd seen her last ultrasound just days ago. Her baby had been healthy, full term, perfect. But the infant in her arms was different, smaller. The features weren't what she'd seen in those grainy black and white images she'd memorized. "This isn't my baby," she whispered, her voice growing stronger with certainty. "Where is my baby?" Dr. Miller stepped closer, his shadow falling across the bed. "Mrs. Carter, I understand this is difficult. The trauma of loss can be overwhelming." "No!" Naomi clutched the bundle closer, studying every detail. "My baby was bigger. I saw him on the ultrasound. He was healthy. Where is my son?" Jordan appeared at her side, his face streaked with tears. "Baby, please." The doctors explained everything. There were complications. They did everything they could. But Naomi couldn't stop staring at the infant's face. Something was deeply, fundamentally wrong. She'd carried her child for 9 months, felt every movement, known every rhythm of his life within her. This stillness, this wrongness, it didn't match the vibrant life she'd nurtured. "I want to see the birth certificate," she demanded, her voice cracking. "I want to see all the documentation." Nurse Rourke materialized at the doorway, her platinum hair pulled back severely from her face. "That won't be possible right now, Mrs. Carter. You need to rest. We can handle all the paperwork later." "No." Naomi tried to push herself up further, ignoring the pain that shot through her body. "I want to see it now. It's my right." Mrs. Carter, Nurse Rourke's voice took on a sharp edge. You're in no condition to be dealing with paperwork. The loss of a child is traumatic. You're not thinking clearly. Jordan placed a hand on Naomi's shoulder. Baby, please, listen to the nurses. You need to rest. But Naomi couldn't rest. Not with the wrongness of everything pressing down on her like a physical weight. The baby in her arms, it wasn't just the size that was wrong. The weight felt off, the temperature wasn't right, and something about the skin tone didn't match what she'd glimpsed in her last ultrasound. I want another doctor, she said firmly. I want a second opinion, and I want to see my medical records. Doctor, Miller exchanged a look with Nurse Rourke that sent chills down Naomi's spine. Mrs. Carter, I understand you're upset, but I assure you, everything was done according to protocol. The best thing now is to begin the grieving process. We can recommend several excellent grief counselors. I don't need a grief counselor. Naomi's voice rose, causing the baby in her arms to shift slightly. Wait, shift? She looked down sharply. Weren't stillborn babies completely still? Before she could voice this observation, Nurse Rourke was already moving forward, reaching for the bundle. Let me take him. This is clearly too much for you right now. Don't touch him. Naomi pulled back, protective instincts flaring. Something isn't right here. Jordan, please. You have to feel it too. This isn't our baby. She could see the conflict in her husband's eyes, the doubt warring with his trust in the medical establishment. He'd always believed in the system, in authority. But now, looking at her face, at the strange bundle in her arms, she could see cracks forming in that belief. Dr. Miller, Jordan said slowly, my wife's concerns seem reasonable. Could we see the documentation, just to put her mind at ease? The doctor's face hardened almost imperceptibly. Mr. Carter, I understand you want to support your wife, but enabling denial will only make the grieving process more difficult. What she needs now is acceptance and rest. Nurse Rourke stepped forward again, her movements precise and determined. We recommend immediate cremation in cases like this. It's better not to prolong the trauma. We can handle all the arrangements. Cremation? Naomi's voice cracked like a whip. No, absolutely not. I want an autopsy. I want DNA tests. I want Mrs. Carter. Nurse Rourke's professional mask slipped for just a moment, revealing something cold and angry underneath. This kind of hysteria isn't helpful. If you can't calm down, we'll have to sedate you. The threat hung in the air like poison. Naomi looked around the room, at the faces watching her with varying degrees of sympathy and calculation. Only one nurse, a younger black woman with warm brown eyes, seemed genuinely troubled by what was happening. Please, Naomi tried, to keep her voice steady. Just show me the birth certificate. Show me the delivery records. That's all I'm asking. Dr. Miller sighed heavily. Nurse Rourke, please prepare a mild sedative. Mrs. Carter clearly needs help managing her grief. As Nurse Rourke left the room, her shoes clicking sharply against the linoleum, the young black nurse moved closer to Naomi's bed, ostensibly to check the monitors. As she leaned over, she whispered so softly Naomi almost missed it. Ask for the autopsy report. The nurse, her nameplate read Angela, straightened up and moved away before Naomi could respond. But the message burned in her mind like a beacon. Someone else saw it. Someone else knew something was wrong. Jordan sat, heavily in the chair beside Naomi's bed, his face drawn with exhaustion and grief. Baby, maybe we should listen to the doctors. They're trying to help. Help? Naomi couldn't keep the bitterness from her voice. They're trying to make us disappear. They want us to cremate our baby without asking questions, without looking too closely at anything. Don't you think that's strange? She could see her words hitting home, see the doubt growing in Jordan's eyes. But before he could respond, Nurse Rourke returned with a syringe, Dr. Miller close behind her. This will help you rest, Nurse Rourke said, moving toward the IV line. No. Naomi's voice was firm. I don't consent to more sedation. I want to see my medical records first. Mrs. Carter, Dr. Miller began, but Naomi cut him off. I have the right to see my own medical records. It's the law. Either show them to me, or I'll call a lawyer right now. The threat of legal involvement caused a subtle shift in the room's atmosphere. Dr. Miller and Nurse Rourke exchanged another look, this one tinged with calculation. "Of course," Dr. Miller said smoothly. "We'll have them brought up from records, but it may take some time to gather everything." "I'll wait," Naomi said, meeting his gaze steadily. As the medical staff filed out of the room, Naomi held the small bundle closer, studying the tiny face. Something about the features seemed artificial, almost waxy, and there was that slight movement she'd felt earlier, definitely not consistent with a stillborn infant. When they were alone, Jordan leaned forward, his voice low. "What are you thinking, baby?" "I'm thinking we need to get help," Naomi whispered, back. "But we have to be careful. They're watching us." Hours passed. The sun set outside the hospital windows, casting long shadows across the room. Nurses came and went, checking vitals, offering platitudes. But no medical records appeared. Finally, while Jordan was getting coffee and most of the staff was changing shifts, Nurse Angela appeared again. She slipped Naomi a folded piece of paper, then busied herself checking equipment. "The records room is understaffed at night," she said quietly, her back to the door. "Security is lighter too. Just saying." Naomi waited until she was gone before unfolding the paper. It contained hastily scribbled directions to the records room in the hospital's basement. Her heart pounding, she realized what she had to do. That night, while the hospital slept and Jordan dozed in the uncomfortable chair beside her bed, Naomi made her move. Her body protested every movement, but determination drove her forward. The basement was dark, lit only by buzzing fluorescent tubes that flickered ominously. Following Angela's directions, she found the records room and, using the code written on the paper, let herself in. Her hand shook as she searched through the files, finally locating her own. What she found made her blood run cold. The labor report was full of inconsistencies. Times didn't match up. Procedures were listed that she knew hadn't happened. And most damning of all, there was a notation in the margin that had been partially erased. "Healthy delivery. Proceed as planned." The sound of footsteps in the corridor sent her hurrying back to her room, the truth of what she'd discovered weighing heavily on her heart. When she walked through her door, she found Nurse Rourke waiting. "Have a nice walk, Mrs. Carter." The nurse's smile was cold, knowing. "You should be more careful, wandering around at night. Anything could happen." The threat was clear, but Naomi stood her ground. "What did you do with my baby?" "Your baby is dead, Mrs. Carter. The sooner you accept that, the better for everyone." Nurse Rourke stepped closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Some questions are better left unasked, for your own sake, and your husband's." As the nurse left, her shoes clicking down the corridor like a metronome counting down to something terrible, Naomi sank onto her bed. The small bundle they'd given her lay in the hospital bassinet, its artificial stillness now clearly obvious to her trained eye. Her real baby was out there somewhere, and she was going to find him, no matter what it took. The morning sunlight streaming through the hospital window did nothing to warm the chill that had settled in Naomi's bones. 3 days had passed since she'd discovered the damning evidence in her medical records, and the hospital was pushing hard for her discharge. Every hour brought new pressure to move forward and begin the healing process. "Mrs. Carter," Dr. Miller's voice carried its usual practiced sympathy as he entered her room for morning rounds. "About the autopsy request. I'm not leaving without one." Naomi cut him off, her voice firm despite her exhaustion. She'd barely slept since that night in the records room, afraid of what might happen if she let her guard down. "I must advise against it," he said, glancing at her charts. "The cause of death is clear. An autopsy would be unnecessarily traumatic. Then you shouldn't have any problem documenting it officially." Naomi met his gaze steadily. "Unless there's something you're trying to hide?" A muscle twitched in Dr. Miller's jaw. "Mrs. Carter, these accusations are becoming problematic. Your husband agrees that immediate cremation would be best. My husband doesn't make medical decisions for me." Naomi's hands clenched in the hospital blanket. I want a full autopsy and DNA testing, or I'm calling every news station in the state. The threat hung in the air between them. Dr. Miller's professional mask slipped for just a moment, revealing something cold and calculating beneath. That would be ill-advised. Grief can make people say things they later regret. Before Naomi could respond, Jordan entered the room. The past few days had aged him visibly, new lines carved around his eyes, his shoulders heavy with sorrow. But there was something else in his expression now, a growing uncertainty that gave Naomi hope. "Baby," he said softly, "I've been thinking about what you said, about the inconsistencies." Dr. Miller straightened, his attention sharpening. "Mr. Carter, we've discussed this. Your wife needs support right now, not encouragement of these delusions. With all due respect, Doctor." Jordan's voice had an edge Naomi had never heard before. "I've been looking at the ultrasound photos from our last appointment. The measurements don't match. Medical records can be complex for lay people to interpret." "I'm so an architectural engineer," Jordan interrupted. "I understand measurements, and these don't add up." A tense silence filled the room. Dr. Miller's hands tightened on his clipboard until his knuckles went white. "I'll have Nurse Rourke bring in the discharge papers." After he left, Jordan turned to Naomi. "I called someone, a journalist who might be able to help." Hope flared in Naomi's chest. "Who?" "Malik Jones. He writes for the Daily Chronicle. He's been investigating St. Augustine's for months, looking into their mortality rates." Jordan lowered his voice. "He wants to meet with us. Today." Naomi nodded, determination replacing her exhaustion. "Help me get dressed." An hour later, they sat in a quiet corner of the hospital cafeteria. Malik Jones was younger than Naomi had expected, but his eyes held a sharp intelligence that put her at ease. He listened intently as she recounted everything: the suspicious behavior, the inconsistent records, Nurse Angela's warning. "You're not the first," he said finally, pulling out a tablet. "Look at this." The screen showed a graph of infant mortality rates by hospital. St. Augustine's bar towered above the others, but with a disturbing pattern. "The deaths are disproportionately from black mothers," Malik explained, his voice tight with controlled anger. "Way above statistical norms. But whenever anyone starts asking questions, the families are pressured into immediate cremation. No autopsies, no investigations." "How many?" Naomi's voice wavered. "That I can confirm. 12 cases in the past year alone, but I suspect there are more." He paused, glancing around the cafeteria. "I've been trying to find families willing to speak out, but most are too afraid." "I'm not afraid," Naomi said, firmly. "I want to meet them, the other mothers." Malik nodded slowly. "I can arrange that, but we need to be careful. After my last article about hospital discrimination, there were incidents." "What kind of incidents?" "Break-ins, stolen research, warning messages." He met her eyes. "These people have a lot to lose if the truth comes out." That afternoon, against medical advice, Naomi checked herself out of the hospital. The process took hours, filled with thinly veiled threats about liability and mental health concerns. Nurse Rourke hovered nearby the entire time, her presence a silent warning. But finally, they were free. Malik drove them to a small house in a quiet suburb where 2 women waited. The first, Patricia Williams, had lost her baby 6 months ago. The second, Tamara Foster, had delivered at St. Augustine's just 3 weeks before Naomi. "They told me it was preeclampsia," Patricia said, her hands wrapped around a cold cup of tea. "But I had perfect blood pressure throughout my pregnancy, perfect tests. Then suddenly during delivery, they said there were complications." "Heavy sedation?" Naomi asked. Patricia nodded. "I barely remember the birth. When I woke up, they said my baby was gone, pushed for immediate cremation." "Same here," Tamara added, her voice bitter. "They wouldn't even let me hold her properly, said it would be too traumatic. But something felt wrong. The baby they showed me, it didn't look like the ultrasound." Naomi felt a chill run down her spine. "Did either of you have Nurse Rourke?" Both. Women stiffened at the name. That woman, Tamara spat. She was always there, watching, whispering with the doctors. We need to find more mothers, Naomi said, her mind racing. There have to be records, proof. There are, a quiet voice said from the doorway. They turned to find Nurse Angela, still in her scrubs. And I know where to find them. The young nurse stepped into the room, her face drawn with worry. I've been collecting evidence for months. Photos, documents, everything I could safely copy. But it's dangerous. Last week, another nurse who was asking questions disappeared. They said she quit, but her locker was still full. Her car was still in the parking lot. Malik leaned forward, his reporter's instincts sharp. We need those records. They're not at the hospital, Angela said. I keep everything in a storage unit. But she hesitated. I think they know I'm gathering evidence. I've been followed. My apartment was broken into last night. As if to underscore her words, a car drove slowly past the house, its tinted windows reflecting the late afternoon sun. Everyone tensed, but it moved on. We need to get those records now, Malik said urgently, before they disappear. The storage facility was on the outskirts of town, a maze of identical metal units baking in the summer heat. Angela's hands shook as she unlocked her unit, revealing boxes of carefully organized documents. Birth records, death certificates, photographs, she explained, pulling out files. Cases where the official records don't match the actual events. Mothers who were over-sedated, babies who vanished, statistics that were altered. Naomi began going through the files, her heart pounding. The pattern was clear. Healthy pregnancies suddenly turning tragic, missing documentation, rushed cremations. All involving Black mothers, all overseen by the same core group of hospital staff. Look at this, Malik said, holding up a photograph. It showed a section of the hospital Naomi had never seen, a secure wing with restricted access. According to the blueprints, this area is supposed to be for storage, but these windows have blackout curtains, and there's medical equipment being moved in and out. A sudden noise made them all jump. Footsteps on gravel, approaching the storage unit. Angela quickly closed the door most of the way, leaving just a crack to peer through. Two men in dark suits walked past, their manner purposeful. Hospital security, Naomi realized, recognizing one from her time in the maternity ward. They followed me, Angela whispered, her face pale. We need to get out of here. They waited until the footsteps faded, then quickly packed the most important documents into Malik's car. As they drove away, Naomi saw more dark vehicles pulling into the storage facility. I can't go back to the hospital, Angela said, her hands still shaking. They'll know I talked. Stay with me, Tamara offered. Safety in numbers. Back at home. That night, Naomi and Jordan spread the documents across their dining room table. The evidence was overwhelming. Dozens of cases, all following the same pattern. But why? What happened to the babies who disappeared? I need to get back into the hospital, Naomi said finally. That restricted wing, if they're keeping babies anywhere. It's too dangerous, Jordan protested. After what happened at the storage unit, a crash from upstairs cut him off. They froze, listening to the sound of footsteps in their bedroom. Jordan grabbed a kitchen knife while Naomi called 911, but by the time the police arrived, the intruders were gone. Nothing had been stolen except one thing, Naomi's pregnancy journal, containing all her ultrasound photos and medical notes. There, trying to erase the evidence, Malik said when they called him. But they made a mistake. I found something in Angela's files, a record of healthy deliveries kept separately from the official death certificates. Your baby's name is on it, Naomi. He was marked healthy at birth. The revelation hit her like a physical blow. Her baby was alive. Somewhere in that hospital, behind those blackout curtains, her son was being held, and she was going to find him. But as she looked at the scattered documents, the growing evidence of a massive conspiracy, Naomi realized they were dealing with something far bigger and more dangerous than she'd initially imagined. This wasn't just about her baby anymore. This was about dozens of stolen children, countless destroyed families, and a system of exploitation. that it operated unchecked for who knew how long. "We need to be smart about this," she said, gathering the documents into a secure folder. "They're watching us now. One wrong move." Jordan wrapped his arms around her, his body tense with protective anger. "We'll find him, baby, and we'll make them pay for what they've done." But even as she leaned into his embrace, Naomi couldn't shake the feeling that they were running out of time. Somewhere in St. Augustine's medical center, behind those sterile, white walls and locked doors, her baby needed her. And nothing, not threats, not danger, not the full force of a corrupt medical establishment, was going to stop her from bringing him home. The question was, how many more families would be destroyed before they could expose the truth? And more importantly, would they live long enough to do it? The burner phone Malik had given them rang at 3 a.m., its harsh tone cutting through the darkness of Naomi and Jordan's bedroom. They'd been staying at a hotel since the break-in, too paranoid to return home. Naomi grabbed the phone on the first ring, her heart pounding. "Stop searching." The voice was distorted, mechanical. "Your baby is alive. That's all you need to know. Stop asking questions or you won't like what happens next." The line went dead before Naomi could respond. Jordan was already up, pulling on clothes. "We need to call Malik." "No," Naomi said, her mind racing. "This is what we needed. Confirmation. Our baby's alive, Jordan. They just admitted it." The revelation energized them both, but it also raised terrifying new questions. Where was their son? Who had him? And what would happen if they kept pushing for answers? Dawn found them in Malik's cramped office at the Daily Chronicle. The journalist's desk was buried under stacks of documents, hospital records, financial statements, employee files. Dark circles under his eyes suggested he hadn't slept. "Look at this," he said, pulling up a spreadsheet on his computer. "I've been tracking Dr. Caldwell's finances." "The hospital administrator?" Jordan leaned closer. "Yeah, the man's been living way above his salary. Multiple homes, luxury cars, private school tuition for his kids. But here's the interesting part. The money's coming through a series of shell companies, all linked to an organization called New Beginnings Adoption Agency." Naomi felt sick. "They're selling the babies? For hundreds of thousands each." Malik pulled up another document. "And guess who's on New Beginnings' board of directors? Sarah Rourke." The pieces were falling into place with horrifying clarity. The targeted sedation, the fake stillbirths, the rushed cremations. It was all part of an organized trafficking operation. A knock at the door made them all jump. It was Terry, an old janitor Malik had interviewed the day before. The man looked nervous, constantly, glancing over his shoulder. "I remembered something else," he said quietly. "About the restricted wing. There's a service elevator that goes down to a sub-basement, not on any official blueprints. That's where they take them. The babies. I've heard them crying." Naomi's hands clenched into fists. "How do we get in?" "You don't understand." Terry's voice shook. "It's not just the hospital. There are powerful people involved. Politicians, judges, wealthy families. They're all part of it. They pay big money for those babies. And they target black mothers because they think we won't fight back," Naomi said bitterly. "That we won't be believed." Jordan put a protective arm around her. "We need proof. Something they can't cover up or explain away." "I might have something," Malik said, pulling out a flash drive. "A former social worker contacted me, Bethany Strauss. She used to work for New Beginnings until she realized what was really happening. She's been collecting evidence, adoption records that don't match birth certificates, money transfers, everything. They spent the morning going through Bethany's files. The scope of the operation was staggering. Dozens of babies had been stolen. Over the years, their births erased and replaced with falsified death certificates. The adoptive families paid massive fees, channeled through a network of offshore accounts. Dr. Caldwell's been running this for at least a decade," Malik explained. "He handpicks the staff involved. Nurse Rourke's his main enforcer. She handles the mothers, makes sure they're too sedated to question anything." "And Angela?" Naomi asked. "Where is she?" A heavy silence fell over the room. Angela hadn't been seen since the storage unit incident. Her apartment was empty, her phone disconnected, It was as if she'd vanished into thin air. "We need to move. Fast," Jordan said, "before anyone else disappears." Malik nodded. "I'm publishing what we have tomorrow. Front page. They'll try to discredit it, but with Bethany's evidence." The office door burst open. It was Bethany herself, wild-eyed and breathless. "They know. Someone leaked. They're destroying everything. All the records, all the evidence. They're shutting it down. The babies." Naomi stood up so quickly her chair fell over. "What about the babies in the hospital? They're moving them tonight. I overheard Rourke on the phone. They have buyers ready, private planes standing by. Once those children leave the country." The implications didn't need to be spelled out. If they didn't act immediately, their chance of finding Naomi's son and all the other stolen children would vanish forever. "We need a plan," Jordan said, his engineering mind already working on the problem. "Terry, that service elevator. Does your keycard access it?" The old janitor nodded. "But there are guards and cameras." "I can handle the cameras," Malik said. "The hospital's security system is outsourced to a company I used to write about. I still have contacts there." Naomi looked at the hospital blueprint spread across Malik's desk. "We need a distraction. Something big enough to draw attention away from the restricted wing." "Leave that to me," Bethany said grimly. "I know which families got those babies. Rich, powerful people who thought their money could buy them anything. Let's see how they handle a very public scandal." They spent the next hours planning, thinking through every detail. It had to be perfect. They would only get one chance. As evening approached, Malik's phone buzzed with a news alert. His face went pale as he read. "Yet they found Angela." Naomi's heart stopped. "Is she?" "Alive, but barely. Car accident on a deserted road. She's in intensive care." His voice hardened. "They're sending a message, warning us off." "Then let's send one back," Naomi said, her voice steel. "Tonight." The plan was set in motion at 9 p.m. Bethany went public, releasing a list of prominent families who had purchased stolen babies through New Beginnings. The story exploded across social media, sending the hospital's PR team into crisis mode. While hospital administrators scrambled to handle the press, Malik's contact disabled the security cameras in the restricted wing. Terry's keycard got them through the first set of doors. The service elevator hummed softly as it descended to the sub-basement. The corridor below was dimly lit and eerily quiet. But as they crept forward, they heard it, the unmistakable sound of babies crying. "This way," Terry whispered, leading them to a heavy door marked storage. Inside, they found a nightmare. The room was filled with hospital bassinets, each containing a newborn. Charts attached to the bassinets listed prices instead of names. In the corner, bags were packed with supplies for transport. "They were going to move them tonight," Jordan said, his voice shaking with rage. Naomi moved from bassinet to bassinet, her heart breaking for each stolen child. Then she saw him, a baby boy with her eyes, Jordan's nose, her son. "Here," she choked out. "Jordan, he's here!" The reunion was cut short by the sound of approaching footsteps. They ducked behind a supply cabinet just as Dr. Caldwell burst in, followed by Nurse Rourke. "Move everything up," he was saying urgently. "The planes can't wait. Once this story breaks fully, it's too late for that, Dr. Caldwell." Everyone turned to find Malik in the doorway, his phone live-streaming everything. Behind him stood a team of FBI agents, their weapons drawn. "Federal agents," a voice boomed. "Everyone on the ground." What followed was chaos. Dr. Caldwell tried to run but was quickly tackled. Nurse Rourke went for a phone, presumably to warn others, but an agent knocked it from her hand. More agents swarmed the room, securing the babies, documenting everything. Naomi held her son close, tears streaming down her face as Jordan wrapped his arms around them both. After everything they'd been through, their family was finally whole. But even in that moment of joy, she couldn't forget the other families, the other mothers who had been deceived, drugged, and robbed of their children. Their stories needed to be told. Justice needed to be served. Hours later, as dawn broke over the city, the full scope of the operation was revealed. 17 babies were rescued from the sub-basement. Records indicated dozens more had already been sold, scattered across the country and abroad. The FBI's investigation uncovered a network that went far beyond St. Augustine's. Other hospitals, other administrators, other families whose wealth had bought them stolen children. The scandal reached into the highest levels of society. Naomi sat in a quiet room at the FBI field office, her sleeping son in her arms. Jordan hadn't left their side, still protective, still processing everything they'd discovered. "Mrs. Carter?" An agent appeared in the doorway. "We need your statement, and there are reporters outside. Your story has gone national." Naomi looked down at her baby, then at Jordan. They both knew what she had to do. "I'll talk to them," she said firmly. "People need to know what happened here. Not just for us, but for every family that's been torn apart by these monsters." The agent nodded, understanding. "We've already had calls from other mothers, women who lost babies at other hospitals, who were told their children were stillborn. Your courage in coming forward, it's giving them hope." Hope. Such a small word for such a powerful force. It had kept Naomi going through the darkest moments, through threats and danger and heartbreak. Now it would light the way for others. As she prepared to face the media, to tell her story to the world, Naomi thought of all the mothers still searching for their children, all the families still broken, still grieving losses that weren't losses at all but thefts. "We're going to find them," she promised her son quietly. "Every single one." The morning sun streamed through the windows, washing away the shadows of the terrible night. Outside, cameras flashed and reporters waited. A new day was beginning, not just for Naomi and her family, but for everyone touched by this tragedy. Justice was coming. The truth was finally being told. And somewhere out there, other stolen children would soon be coming home. The morning sun cast long shadows across Naomi's kitchen table, now covered with files, photos, and newspaper clippings. 3 days had passed since Malik's explosive blog post about St. Augustine's baby trafficking ring, and the leads were pouring in. But one name kept surfacing. Bethany Strauss, a former social worker who'd left New Beginnings Adoption Agency, under mysterious circumstances. "She's scared," Malik said, hanging up his phone after another failed attempt to contact her. "Someone's been following her. She won't meet in person." Naomi pressed her hands flat against the table, steadying herself. "We need her testimony. She's the only one who knows where these babies ended up." Jordan paced behind them, his normally calm demeanor fractured by worry. The threats had escalated since Malik's post went live. Their house had been watched, their phones tapped. Last night, someone had slashed their car tires. "Maybe we should let the FBI handle this," Jordan suggested, not for the first time. "They have resources, protection." "They also have red tape," Malik interrupted, "and corrupted officials. We don't know how high this goes." A knock at the door made them all freeze. Jordan moved to answer it, baseball bat in hand, but it was only Lisa, Naomi's best friend, looking haunted. "I found something," she said, dropping her purse on the table. "You remember my cousin Jennifer, the one who had her babies at St. Augustine's? She just called me, hysterical. Said she recognized Dr. Caldwell in the news. He wasn't just the administrator. He personally handled all the premium adoptions." Naomi's heart raced. Premium adoptions? That's what they called them. Healthy black babies delivered to wealthy white families. They charged extra for it, called it a cultural adaptation fee. Lisa's voice cracked with disgust. Malik was already typing. "This connects to something in Bethany's initial statement. She mentioned a special list of clients, families willing to pay more for specific requirements." The implications made Naomi sick. They weren't just stealing babies. They were treating them like designer products, selling them to the highest bidder based on physical characteristics. Another knock, more urgent this time. They all tensed, but it was Terry, the hospital janitor, who'd helped expose the sub-basement nursery. "Bethany called me," he said, still catching his breath. "She's ready to talk, but not here. She says she has proof. Documentation of every baby sold through New Beginnings in the past 5 years." "Where is she?" Naomi was already grabbing her coat. "An old motel outside the city. But we have to go now. She thinks they're closing in on her. The drive to the motel took 40 tense minutes. They split into 2 cars to avoid being followed. Naomi and Jordan in one, Malik and Terry in another. Lisa stayed behind to coordinate with other families who'd been contacting them since the story broke. The Sun Valley Motel had seen better days. Paint peeled from its walls, and half the neon letters in its sign had burnt out. Bethany's room was on the 2nd floor, tucked away in a corner. She opened the door just enough to verify their identities before letting them in. The woman behind the door was a far cry from the polished social worker in her LinkedIn photo. Her hair was unwashed, her clothes rumpled, and her eyes held the haunted look of someone who hadn't slept in days. "I should have come forward sooner," she said, hands shaking as she pulled documents from a battered briefcase. "But they made threats, not just against me, against my family, my children." "We understand," Naomi said gently. "You're doing the right thing now." Bethany spread the papers across the motel room's small table. "These are the real adoption records. Names, dates, payments, everything. But there's one family you need to focus on. The Dawsons." The name meant nothing to Naomi, but Malik sucked in a sharp breath. Thomas Dawson, the real estate developer? And his wife, Catherine. They've been trying to adopt for years but kept getting rejected. Background check issues. Bethany pulled out a specific file. 3 weeks ago, they suddenly got a baby. A black newborn boy delivered through New Beginnings. The timing matches. She didn't need to finish the sentence. Naomi's hands trembled as she opened the file. The baby's statistics matched her son's perfectly. "Where are they?" Jordan's voice was tight with controlled rage. "They have an estate in Riverside Heights. But you can't just go there. They're protected. Private security, political connections. And they'll claim they adopted the baby legally. They have paperwork, all of it forged by New Beginnings." "We'll need proof," Malik said, already photographing documents. "DNA tests, hospital records." A sound from outside cut him off. Cars pulling into the parking lot, doors slamming. Terry rushed to the window. "Black SUVs. 4 of them. Hospital." "Security," Bethany whispered, face pale. "They found me." The next few minutes were chaos. They shoved documents into bags while heavy footsteps thundered up the motel stairs. Bethany led them to a service exit, an old door half hidden behind a vending machine. They split up again. Bethany with Terry, Malik alone, Naomi, and Jordan, together. As they sped away, Naomi saw men in dark suits swarming the motel room they'd just vacated. "We need to get to the Dawsons," Naomi said, clutching the file. "Before they realize we know and try to move him." Jordan nodded grimly, turning their car toward Riverside Heights. The exclusive neighborhood was a world away from their modest suburb, gated mansions set back from tree-lined streets, perfectly manicured lawns stretching for acres. The Dawson estate was obvious even among its grand neighbors. A sprawling stone mansion protected by high walls and an elaborate security system. They parked down the street watching. "How do we get in?" Jordan wondered aloud. But Naomi had already spotted something, a familiar blue blanket hanging on a line in the back garden, the blanket she'd bought for her baby shower, embroidered with little silver stars. "That's my blanket," she whispered, tears stinging her eyes. "They have him, Jordan. Our baby's in there." They spent the day observing the house, noting patterns. Catherine Dawson left twice, once for yoga, once for lunch with friends. Thomas Dawson's car never moved. He worked from home in his study. A nanny came and went, and guards patrolled the grounds regularly. As evening approached, they saw Catherine walking in the garden, talking on her phone. Thanks to a parabolic microphone Malik had borrowed from his newspaper's investigative team, they could hear every word. "Of course we didn't know," she was saying, her voice defensive. "New Beginnings is a respected agency. How were we supposed to know the baby was obtained inappropriately? No, we're not giving him back. We paid for, we legally adopted him." End of discussion. The admission was like a knife to Naomi's heart. They knew. They knew they'd bought a stolen baby, and they didn't care. Malik's blog post about the trafficking ring was gaining traction. Local news stations had picked up the story, and social media was buzzing with accusations and theories. The pressure was building. Then Naomi's phone buzzed, a text from an unknown number. "Back off, or your baby won't be the only one who disappears." She showed it to Jordan, who immediately called their contact at the FBI. Agent Sarah Williams had been handling their case since the raid on St. Augustine's. "We're building a case," Agent Williams assured them. "But these people have resources. They've already started moving other babies to different locations. If the Dawsons have your son, we need concrete proof before we can act. They have my blanket," Naomi said, "the one I bought specifically for him. And their adoption paperwork matches his birth date exactly. That's circumstantial. We need DNA evidence, clear documentation." "By then it could be too late," Naomi exploded. "They could take him anywhere." The agent's silence spoke volumes. They were on their own. That night, they met with Malik and Terry in a 24-hour diner, away from prying eyes. Bethany had gone into protective custody after the motel incident, but not before giving them everything she had on the Dawsons. "Thomas Dawson's company has private planes," Malik reported. 3 of them. "And Catherine just booked tickets to Switzerland for next week. They're planning to run," Jordan realized. "We can't let that happen." Naomi's voice was steel. "We need to get him out. Now." The plan they formed was dangerous, possibly illegal, but it was all they had. Terry still had his maintenance uniform and key cards from the hospital. With some modifications, they might get them past the Dawson's security. But as they finalized the details, Naomi's phone buzzed again. This time it was Lisa, her voice tight with fear. "They're here," she whispered. "Hospital security at my house. They're asking about Bethany's files. They know I've been helping you." "Get out," Naomi told her. "Go to your sisters. Don't tell anyone where you are." The net was closing in. They had to move fast. The next day dawned clear and cold. Naomi watched the Dawson estate through binoculars, her heart pounding as Catherine's car pulled out of the gates. The woman was headed to her regular salon appointment. 2 hours when the house would be less guarded. Jordan and Terry, dressed as maintenance workers, approached the gate with clipboards and fake work orders. Malik was parked nearby, ready to create a distraction if needed. And Naomi. Naomi was trying not to think about everything that could go wrong. Their earpieces crackled. Terry had managed to get them past the first checkpoint. Now they just had to find proof, something concrete enough for the FBI to act on. But as the minutes ticked by, Naomi realized with growing horror that the Dawsons had been tipped off. The house was emptying, staff carrying boxes to waiting cars. They were moving him. Now, what happened next would change everything. The careful plan dissolved into desperate action. And somewhere in that mansion, a baby boy was about to be spirited away from his real family for the second time, unless Naomi could stop it. The sun climbed higher in the sky as she made her decision. Sometimes, she realized, justice couldn't wait for the system to catch up. Sometimes a mother had to take matters into her own hands. With that thought, she stepped out of the car, ready to fight for her son. The morning light caught the tears on her face, but her steps didn't falter. She was done hiding, done waiting, done playing by their rules. It was time to bring her baby home. The morning sun had barely crested over St. Augustine's Medical Center when the FBI raid began. Dozens of agents in tactical gear swarmed the building, their movements precise and coordinated. Dr. Caldwell was in his office when they reached him, calmly shredding documents as if he'd been expecting them. "David Caldwell, Agent Williams," announced, her badge glinting in the fluorescent light. "You're under arrest for human trafficking, medical fraud, and conspiracy." The hospital administrator's composed facade cracked just slightly. "I assume you have evidence to support these ridiculous accusations?" "Every bit of it." Malik stepped into the office, holding up a flash drive. "Financial records, falsified. Death certificates, adoption paperwork. Everything Bethany Strauss collected. Plus some interesting offshore accounts we found." Down in the maternity ward, another team of agents surrounded Nurse Sarah Rourke as she tried to slip out through a service entrance. The platinum-haired nurse's face contorted with rage as they cuffed her. "You don't understand," she spat. We're helping those babies, giving them better lives, better opportunities. By stealing them from their mothers?" Naomi emerged from around the corner, Jordan at her side. By destroying families? The evidence they'd gathered was damning. Records found in Dr. Caldwell's hidden safe revealed dozens of babies stolen over the years. Their biological parents told they were stillborn, while the infants were sold to wealthy families for hundreds of thousands of dollars each. In the hospitals, administrative offices, FBI forensic accountants uncovered a complex money laundering operation. Every stolen child had been logged as a premium adoption, with payments routed through a maze of shell companies. "The network is bigger than we thought," Agent Williams told Naomi as they watched the arrests unfold. Other hospitals, other administrators. This wasn't just about St. Augustine's. It was an organized trafficking ring operating across multiple states. Naomi's hands trembled as she looked through the files. So many stolen children. So many shattered families. How many? We've confirmed at least 47 cases here at St. Augustine's alone. But there could be more. Some records were destroyed before we could secure them. Jordan, who had initially doubted his wife's suspicions, now stood firmly by her side. The guilt of his earlier skepticism had transformed into fierce determination to help expose the truth. "What about the Dawsons?" he asked. "They still have our son." Agent Williams nodded grimly. "We're moving on their estate now. But they're claiming they adopted him legally through New Beginnings. They have paperwork." "Forged paperwork," Malik interrupted, holding up more documents from Bethany's files. "Look at these adoption records. The dates don't match the hospital's delivery logs, and the DNA samples they submitted, they're from a different child entirely." The revelation was enough for a judge to issue an emergency warrant. Within hours, federal agents surrounded the Dawson estate. Thomas Dawson blustered and threatened, waving his phone at the agents. "Do you know who I am? Who my friends are? I've got judges on speed dial." "Your friends are being arrested as we speak," Agent Williams cut him off, "including Judge Harrison, who approved all those suspicious adoptions. Now, where's the baby?" Catherine Dawson, perfectly coiffed even in the midst of chaos, tried a different approach. "We had no idea," she insisted, tears welling in her expertly made-up eyes. "New Beginnings told us everything was legal. We paid our fees, filled out all the proper paperwork. You paid $300,000 for a rushed adoption with no background check." Naomi stepped forward, her voice shaking. With controlled rage, "You knew exactly what you were doing. Where is my son?" The answer came in the form of a cry from upstairs. Naomi's heart leaped. She would know that sound anywhere. She ran up the marble staircase, past protesting security guards, following the sound to a luxurious nursery. There, in a hand-carved crib that probably cost more than her car, was her baby boy. His eyes, so like her own, lit up with recognition as she approached. "DNA testing will confirm he's yours," Agent Williams said softly from the doorway. "But looking at him now, there's no doubt. He has your eyes." The Dawsons were taken into custody, their protests falling on deaf ears as evidence of their knowing participation in the trafficking scheme mounted. Bank records showed multiple wire transfers to offshore accounts. Email exchanges revealed they'd specifically requested a healthy African-American infant, willing to pay extra for a rushed placement. Back at the FBI field office, Naomi finally got to hold her son properly, tears streaming down her face as Jordan wrapped his arms around them both. They named him Elijah, a name that meant, "The Lord is my God," chosen to honor the divine intervention they felt had helped bring him home. The story exploded across national news. Malik's detailed expose ran on the front page of the Daily Chronicle, accompanied by photographs of Dr. Caldwell and Nurse Rourke in handcuffs. The headline read, "Stolen Futures Inside the Hospital Baby Trafficking Ring." As the investigation widened, more families came forward. Parents who had been told their babies were stillborn, who had been pressured into immediate cremation, who had noticed inconsistencies but been too afraid to speak up. DNA testing began matching stolen children with their biological parents. The scale of corruption stunned the nation. Hospital board members were implicated. Politicians who had looked the other way in exchange for donations were exposed. Wealthy families who had purchased babies faced criminal charges. St. Augustine's medical center was shut down, pending a complete investigation. The once pristine halls were now sealed with crime scene tape, its reputation irrevocably tarnished. Week after the raids, Naomi sat in a courtroom, Elijah sleeping peacefully in her arms as she testified about her experience. Her voice grew stronger as she described the suspicious behavior, the excessive sedation, the fake stillbirth. "They counted on our pain," she told the grand jury. "They thought our grief would silence us, that we wouldn't fight back, that we wouldn't be believed." Dr. Caldwell and Nurse Rourke sat at the defendant's table, their professional facades crumbling as victim after victim took the stand. The evidence against them was overwhelming. Bank records showed millions in illegal payments. Former staff members testified about the secret ward where stolen babies were kept before being sold. The Dawsons faced their own day in court, their expensive lawyers unable to explain away the damning paper trail. Their claims of ignorance fell apart under scrutiny as prosecutors revealed email exchanges discussing premium adoptions and the need for discretion. "These weren't adoptions," the prosecutor declared in her opening statement. "This was human trafficking, plain and simple. They didn't just steal babies, they stole futures, families, hope itself." The testimonies continued for days. Hospital. Staff who had participated in the scheme turned state's evidence revealing the inner workings of the trafficking operation. Social workers from New Beginnings detailed how babies were matched with wealthy buyers, how paperwork was falsified, how mothers were deceived. Bethany Strauss, no longer in hiding, provided crucial testimony about the financial aspects of the operation. Her meticulous records showed how millions of dollars had flowed through the fake adoption agency, enriching everyone involved in the scheme. "They had a price list," she revealed, her voice trembling. "Different rates based on the baby's characteristics. They treated these children like commodities, not human beings." For Naomi and Jordan, each day brought new horrors as the full scope of the conspiracy was revealed. But it also brought hope. Other stolen children were being found, other families reunited. The system that had enabled these crimes was being dismantled, piece by corrupt piece. 1 month after the arrests, Dr. Caldwell and Nurse Rourke were formally indicted on multiple federal charges. The hospital board members who had knowingly participated in the scheme faced conspiracy charges. The Dawsons and other families who had purchased stolen babies were charged with trafficking. But the greatest victory came in the form of new legislation. Inspired by the St. Augustine's case, lawmakers passed strict new regulations for adoption agencies and hospitals. Requirements for documentation were strengthened. Oversight was increased. Independent verification of infant deaths became mandatory. "This won't bring back the years stolen from these families," Senator Marshall declared as she introduced the bill. "But it will help ensure that no other mother has to go through what these women endured." For Naomi, justice wasn't just about punishment. It was about change. She began speaking at conferences, sharing her story to raise awareness about discrimination in healthcare. Her testimony before a congressional committee helped spark a national conversation about racial bias in medical treatment. Jordan, transformed by their ordeal, left his engineering firm to start a nonprofit organization dedicated to helping families navigate the healthcare system. Their experience had shown them how easily vulnerable parents could be exploited by those in positions of power. Malik's reporting on the case won multiple awards, but he remained focused on following the still unfolding story. There were other hospitals to investigate, other trafficking networks to expose. The work was far from over. The FBI's investigation continued to expand, reaching into other states, other institutions. Agent Williams kept them updated on new developments, new arrests, new families reunited with their stolen children. 6 months after the raid on St. Augustine's, Naomi stood in front of a crowd at a justice reform rally, Elijah secure in her arms. Looking out at the sea of faces, many of them other mothers who had nearly had their children stolen, she felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. "They thought we would stay quiet," she told the crowd, her voice carrying across the square. "They thought our pain would silence us, but they underestimated the strength of a mother's love. They underestimated our determination to find the truth, to fight for justice, to protect our children. The crowd erupted in cheers and tears as she held Elijah higher, a living symbol of hope and resilience. Her son, once stolen but now returned, blinked at the noise and smiled, a smile that proved love could triumph over greed, truth over deception, justice over corruption. In the end, that was what mattered most. Not just the arrests or the legislation or the systemic changes, but the simple fact that families torn apart by greed and prejudice were being made whole again. Children stolen in their first moments of life were finding their way home. As Naomi looked down at Elijah's sleeping face that night, she whispered a promise, not just to him, but to all the children still out there, still waiting to be found. We won't stop until every single one of you is home, until every family has justice, until every mother's arms hold the child meant for them. The battle for justice had been won, but the war against corruption and exploitation continued, and Naomi Carter, once a victim, but now a warrior, would keep fighting until every stolen child was returned, every corrupt official exposed, every broken family healed. Because some battles were worth any cost, any sacrifice, and the right of a mother to hold her child was the most sacred right of all. The nightmares still came, even 6 months after Elijah's return. Naomi would wake in a cold sweat, her heart racing, convinced she was back in that hospital room with Nurse Rourke's cold smile looming over her. On those nights, she would creep into the nursery just to watch her son sleep, to reassure herself that he was really there. Tonight was one of those nights. The digital clock read 3:17 a.m. as she sat in the rocking chair beside Elijah's crib, listening to his peaceful breathing. The nursery walls, painted with gentle clouds and stars, seemed to glow softly in the moonlight. The PTSD won't go away overnight, her therapist had told her. What you experienced was deeply traumatic. Give yourself time to heal. But healing wasn't linear. Some days were easier than others. Some moments brought unexpected triggers, a glimpse of platinum blonde hair in a crowd, the antiseptic smell of a doctor's office, the sound of a baby crying in a store. Jordan found her there as dawn approached, wrapping a warm blanket around her shoulders. "Another nightmare?" She nodded, leaning into his embrace. "I keep seeing their faces, not just Rourke and Caldwell, but all of them. The nurses who helped them, the Dawsons, everyone who thought they could just take our baby. They can't hurt us anymore," Jordan reminded her gently. "They're in prison. Elijah's home. We're safe." As if recognizing his father's voice, Elijah stirred in his crib, dark eyes blinking open. His smile, still toothless but brilliantly bright, never failed to melt Naomi's heart. Later that morning, as she prepared for another day of interviews and advocacy work, a familiar face appeared on the morning news. It was the elderly woman from the pharmacy, the one who had first warned her about St. Augustine's. "Martha Washington," the caption read. "Former St. Augustine's nurse speaks out." Naomi turned up the volume, her coffee forgotten in her hand. "I lost my own grandbaby there," Martha was saying, her voice strong despite her age. 30 years ago. They told my daughter she was stillborn, but I knew something was wrong. But nobody would listen to us back then." The interviewer leaned forward. "Is that why you started warning other mothers?" "Someone had to. These people, they've been doing this for decades, targeting black mothers, stealing our babies, selling them like property. I couldn't stop them back then, but I could try to warn others." Naomi's hands trembled as she reached for her phone. Within an hour, she was sitting in Martha Washington's small but immaculate living room, listening to a story 3 decades in the making. "They were smarter back then," Martha explained, her weathered hands wrapped around a teacup. "No paper trails, no adoption agencies. Just babies disappearing. Mothers told they were stillborn. My Sarah never recovered from the loss. Died of a broken heart 5 years later." "I'm so sorry," Naomi whispered. "Don't be sorry, child. Be strong. What you did, exposing them, fighting back, it's what we needed. You gave voice to generations of mothers who were silenced." The conversation with Martha sparked something in Naomi. That evening, she called Lisa, who had been helping coordinate support groups for affected families. "We need to document everything," Naomi said. "Not just the recent cases, but all of them. Every baby stolen, every mother deceived. Their stories need to be told." The project grew quickly. Malik helped them set up a website where families could share their experiences. Women from across the country began coming forward, some with stories dating back decades. Jordan, watching his wife throw herself into the work, worried about the toll it was taking. "You need to rest too, baby. You can't carry everyone's pain." But Naomi couldn't stop. Each story they documented, each family they helped, felt like a step toward healing. Not just for herself, but for an entire community that had been victimized for too long. The breakthrough came unexpectedly. During one of their support group meetings, a young nurse named Rachel broke down crying. "I worked at St. Augustine's 10 years ago," she confessed. "I didn't know about the trafficking then, but I saw things. Healthy babies declared stillborn, mothers sedated without consent. I tried to report it, but administration shut me down. They threatened my license, my career. I've carried that guilt ever since." Her testimony, added to others from former hospital staff, helped prosecutors uncover dozens of historical cases. The statute of limitations had expired for many, but the evidence still mattered. It showed a pattern stretching back decades. One morning, as Naomi was preparing for another interview, Jordan broke down. She found him in Elijah's nursery, tears streaming down his face as he watched their son play. "I'm so sorry," he sobbed. "I should have believed you from the start. When you said something was wrong, when you questioned the hospital, I doubted you, my own wife, and I chose to believe them instead." Naomi held him as he cried, her own tears falling. "You believe me now. You fought beside me when it mattered most. That's what counts." Their healing journey wasn't just about processing trauma. It was about rebuilding trust, strengthening their bonds as a family, learning to feel safe again. Malik's investigative work continued to make waves. His series on medical discrimination and baby trafficking was nominated for several prestigious journalism awards, but more importantly, it was creating change. "New protocols are being implemented in hospitals nationwide," he told them over dinner one evening. "Independent oversight committees, stricter documentation requirements, better security measures. What happened at St. Augustine's is becoming a case study in medical ethics programs." The ripples spread further. Naomi was invited to speak at medical conferences, sharing her story with healthcare providers and administrators. Her experiences became part of a larger conversation about racial bias in medicine. "It's not just about stopping criminal enterprises," she would tell her audiences. "It's about addressing the systemic issues that allowed these crimes to happen. The assumptions, the biases, the power imbalances that made some mothers more vulnerable than others." Her advocacy work led to the creation of a national task force focused on preventing medical exploitation. Hospitals across the country began reviewing their practices, particularly in maternity wards. But the most powerful moments were the quiet ones, like when she connected with Janet Turner, another mother whose baby had been stolen at St. Augustine's 15 years ago. "I never had another child," Janet told her, clutching a faded ultrasound photo. "I couldn't bear the thought of going through that again. For 15 years I've lived with this hole in my heart, thinking I was crazy for doubting their story." Through DNA testing and database matching, Janet's daughter was finally found, a teenager living with an affluent family in Seattle. The reunion was bittersweet, complicated by years of separation and competing attachments. But it was a start, a chance for healing. The support group expanded, becoming a national network for families affected by medical trafficking. They offered counseling, legal assistance, and most importantly, understanding. Every Tuesday night in a church basement or community center, mothers gathered to share their stories, their pain, their hope. One evening, a young pregnant woman came to a meeting, frightened and seeking advice. "How do I protect myself?" she asked. "How do I make sure this doesn't happen to my baby?" The question sparked a new initiative. Naomi and Lisa began developing educational programs for expectant mothers, especially those from vulnerable communities. They created resources, checklists, and support networks. Knowledge is power, Naomi would tell them. Know your rights, ask questions, trust your instincts, and most importantly, know that you're not alone. Jordan's transformation was remarkable. From an initial skeptic, he became a fierce advocate for patient rights and family justice. His engineering background proved valuable as they worked to develop better security systems for maternity wards. "No parent should ever have to go through what we did," he said during a television interview. "No father should have to doubt his wife when she says something is wrong. We need to change not just the systems, but the mindsets that allow these crimes to happen." As months passed, healing came in unexpected ways, like the day Naomi returned to Patterson's pharmacy, the place where Martha had first warned her. The familiar aisles that had once held such dark memories now felt different. She found herself in the baby section, running her fingers over tiny socks and onesies, just as she had that day. But this time, there was no fear, no foreboding. Instead, she felt strength, the strength of a mother who had fought back, who had won. The biggest surprise came at a conference on healthcare reform. Naomi was scheduled to speak about patient advocacy when she spotted a familiar face in the audience. Angela, the nurse who had helped her at St. Augustine's. "I had to go into hiding after everything happened," Angela explained later, over coffee. "The people involved, they had connections everywhere. But watching you stand up to them, seeing you fight back, it gave me the courage to come forward too." Angela's testimony had been crucial in securing convictions for several hospital board members who had initially escaped charges. Her detailed knowledge of the hospital's operations helped prosecutors understand the full scope of the trafficking ring. 1 year after Elijah's return, Naomi stood in his nursery again, but this time not because of nightmares. She watched as her son pulled himself up on his crib rails, babbling happily in the early morning light. "Mama," he said clearly, reaching for her, the first time he'd said it. The word brought tears to her eyes, tears not of fear or pain, but of joy. This was what healing looked like, not the absence of scars, but the presence of new life, new hope, new beginnings. Later that day, she visited Martha Washington again. The elderly woman was frailer now, but her spirit remained strong. "You did it, child," Martha said, holding Naomi's hand. "You broke the cycle. You gave us all our voices back." "We did it together," Naomi corrected gently. "All of us. Every mother who spoke up, every nurse who came forward, every person who refused to stay silent." That evening, as she prepared for another support group meeting, Naomi looked at the photos on her wall. Images of Elijah growing, smiling, thriving. Pictures of their extended family of survivors, mothers, fathers, children reunited against all odds. The nightmares still came sometimes. The trauma didn't disappear completely. But it no longer defined her. She was more than a victim, more than a survivor. She was a mother who had fought for her child, a woman who had helped expose decades of injustice, a voice for those who had been silenced for too long. And in her son's eyes, in his laughter, in his growing strength, she saw the future they had, all fought for. A future where every mother's love was respected, every child's life valued, every family's bonds protected. It wasn't the end of their story. In many ways, it was just the beginning. But it was a beginning built on truth, justice, and the unshakable power of a mother's love. The federal courthouse stood imposing against the morning sky, its marble steps crowded with reporters and cameras. Inside, in a packed courtroom, Judge Rebecca Winters prepared to deliver the sentences that would mark the end of a 2-year legal battle against the St. Augustine's trafficking ring. Naomi sat in the front row, Elijah sleeping peacefully in her arms. Now a toddler, his cherubic face bore a striking resemblance to his mother's, especially around the eyes. Jordan sat beside them, his hand protectively clasped with hers. Dr. David Caldwell and Nurse Sarah Rourke sat at the defendant's table, their designer suits and confident demeanors a stark contrast to their prison jumpsuits. Behind them, Thomas and Catherine Dawson waited with their own legal team, their faces drawn with the realization that wealth and connections couldn't save them this time. "Will the defendants please rise?" Judge Winters commanded, her voice cutting. through the tense silence. The evidence presented during the trial had been overwhelming. Financial records showed millions of dollars flowing through offshore accounts. DNA tests confirmed dozens of stolen children. Former staff members had testified about the elaborate scheme that had operated for over a decade. Dr. David Caldwell, Judge Winters began, her tone heavy with authority. This court finds your actions not only criminal but morally reprehensible. You abused your position of trust to prey upon vulnerable mothers. You treated newborn babies as commodities to be bought and sold. The depth of your corruption is staggering. Caldwell remained stoic as the judge continued. For the charges of human trafficking, medical fraud, conspiracy, and multiple RICO violations, this court sentences you to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Naomi felt Jordan's hand tighten around hers. Nurse Sarah Rourke, the judge turned her attention to the platinum-haired nurse. Your direct participation in these crimes, your willingness to deceive and traumatize mothers in their most vulnerable moments, shows a callousness that this court finds particularly disturbing. You are hereby sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Rourke's composed facade finally cracked, her face contorted with rage as she was led away, but her eyes found Naomi in the crowd, filled with a hatred that sent chills down Naomi's spine. The Dawsons were next. Catherine Dawson began to sob as the judge detailed their crimes. You claim you were unaware of the illegal nature of the adoption, Judge Winters stated. However, the evidence shows multiple email exchanges where you specifically requested a rush delivery and agreed to pay additional fees to bypass normal procedures. Your willing participation in this trafficking scheme makes you equally culpable. Thomas Dawson stood rigid as the sentence was delivered. 25 years for each of them, plus substantial financial reparations to be paid to the affected families. As the defendants were led away, Malik slipped into the seat beside Naomi, his notebook already open. The young journalist's coverage of the case had earned him multiple awards, but more importantly, it had helped expose similar operations across the country. The hospital board members are next, he whispered. Their trial starts next month, and the FBI just uncovered another trafficking ring in Chicago, using the same methods. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed as the families emerged. Naomi had become the face of the movement, her story inspiring other mothers to come forward, to fight back. Mrs. Carter, they called. How do you feel about the sentences? Justice was served today, she stated firmly, Elijah watching the cameras curiously from her arms. But our work isn't finished. There are still families out there searching for their children. There are still hospitals and institutions that need to be held accountable. Back at home that evening, they hosted a gathering of survivors and supporters. Martha Washington sat in the place of honor, her aged face beaming as she watched children playing. Children who might never have found their way home, if not for their collective fight. 14 babies reunited with their birth parents so far, Lisa announced, reading from her tablet. And the FBI's Special Task Force is investigating 23 more potential cases. The numbers were both heartening and heartbreaking. Each reunion represented a family made whole, but also reminded them of the countless others still searching, still hoping. Malik shared updates on the legal front. The new federal guidelines for maternity wards are being implemented nationwide. Independent oversight committees, mandatory DNA testing for all infant deaths, strict security protocols. St. Augustine's is becoming a case study in medical ethics programs. Angela, who had risked everything to help expose the truth, bounced, Elijah on her knee. She had become like family over the past 2 years, her testimony helping to convict not only the hospital staff, but several corrupt officials who had enabled the trafficking ring. Remember when we first met? She asked Naomi. I was so scared to help, but something in your eyes. I knew I had to do something. The doorbell rang, and Jordan returned with an unexpected guest, Bethany Strauss, the former social worker, whose evidence had been crucial to breaking the case. She looked healthier now, the haunted look in her eyes replaced with determination. I've been working with the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, she announced. We're creating a database to help match stolen babies with their biological parents. DNA testing, birth records, everything. The conversation turned to the broader changes their case had sparked. Hospitals across the country were reviewing their practices. Medical schools were incorporating new ethics training. State legislatures were passing stronger regulations for adoption agencies. But perhaps the most significant change was in public awareness. The story had sparked a national conversation about medical racism, about the vulnerability of minority mothers, about the need for greater oversight and accountability in healthcare. Naomi's book about her experience had become a bestseller, its proceeds funding a foundation to assist families affected by medical trafficking. Jordan had left his engineering career to work full-time on hospital security systems, developing protocols to prevent similar crimes. As evening turned to night, the gathering slowly dispersed. Martha was the last to leave, pausing to cup Naomi's face in her weathered hands. "You did what I couldn't do 30 years ago," she said softly. "You fought back. You won. My grandbaby would be proud." Later, as Naomi put Elijah to bed, she studied his peaceful face in the soft glow of his nightlight. He was growing so fast, already showing hints of the person he would become. His favorite word was mama, said with such joy and certainty that it brought tears to her eyes every time. Jordan found her there, lost in thought. "Penny for your thoughts, baby?" "I was thinking about all the other children out there," she said quietly. "The ones we haven't found yet. Their mothers are still waiting, still searching." He wrapped his arms around her. "And we'll keep fighting until every one of them comes home. That's what our foundation is for. That's what all of this has been about." The next morning brought more work. Naomi had a speaking engagement at a medical conference, sharing her story with healthcare providers from across the country. Her message was always the same: the importance of listening to mothers, of questioning suspicious practices, of standing up against systemic abuse. "It's not enough to punish the criminals," she told her audience. "We have to change the culture that allowed these crimes to happen. We have to ensure that every mother, regardless of her race or background, is heard and respected." The changes were already visible. Hospitals were implementing new security measures. Adoption agencies faced stricter oversight. Medical staff were being trained to recognize and report suspicious practices. But perhaps the most powerful change was in the survivors themselves. Women who had once been silenced were finding their voices. Families who had been torn apart were healing, supporting each other, fighting for justice together. That afternoon, Naomi visited the site of the former St. Augustine's Medical Center. The building stood empty now, its windows dark, its once pristine walls covered with weather stains. A sign announced its upcoming demolition. The land would be used for a new community health center, one focused on maternal care and family support. As she stood there, remembering the fear and pain she had experienced within those walls, a young pregnant woman approached her. "Are you Naomi Carter?" the woman asked hesitantly. "I read your book. I'm scared to give birth. Scared something like that could happen to me." Naomi reached out and took the woman's hand. "Knowledge is power," she said warmly. "Let me tell you about your rights, about the questions you should ask, about the support systems that are there for you now." They talked for over an hour, sharing fears and hopes. Before they parted, Naomi gave the woman her card and a promise that she wouldn't have to face her journey alone. That evening, as the sun set over the city, Naomi sat in Elijah's nursery, watching him play with his toys. His laughter filled the room, pure and joyful, untouched by the darkness that had nearly stolen him away. Jordan joined them, sitting on the floor to help Elijah build a tower of blocks. Their son's determination as he carefully stacked each piece reminded Naomi of their own journey, how they had built their case piece by piece, never giving up despite the obstacles. "Mama, look!" Elijah called out as his tower grew taller. "I see you, baby," she replied, her heart full. "I see you." The words held special meaning for them both. How many times had she feared she would never see him again? How close had they come to losing him forever? But they had won. They had exposed the truth, brought down the criminals, changed the system. Their son was home, safe in their arms, growing stronger every day. As night fell, Naomi thought about all they had accomplished. The convictions today were just the beginning. There would be more trials, more investigations, more families to help. The foundation was growing, reaching more people, making real change happen. But for now, in this moment, watching her son play with his father, hearing his laughter echo through their home, Naomi felt a peace she had fought hard to achieve. They were safe. They were together. They were healing. And somewhere out there, other mothers were finding hope in their story. Other families were fighting their own battles for justice. Other children were finding their way home. The work would continue tomorrow. The fight for justice never really ended. But tonight, in this room filled with love and laughter, Naomi Carter knew with absolute certainty that they had won the most important battle of all. They had their son back. They had exposed the truth. They had changed the system that had tried to destroy them, and most importantly, they had shown that love, a mother's love, a father's love, a community's love, could triumph over even the darkest evil. As she tucked Elijah into bed that night, Naomi whispered the words she had fought so hard to be able to say, "You were always mine, my precious boy, and now you're home where you belong." In his sleep, Elijah smiled, secure in the knowledge that he was safe, he was loved, he was exactly where he was meant to be, and that, in the end, was the greatest victory of all.